He told me he wanted a divorce on Christmas Eve. I still remember how calmly he said it, as if he were asking for more coffee. The tree was glowing in the corner. The house smelled of cinnamon and pine, and snow whispered against the window. Everything looked perfect, except for the sound of my heart breaking. My name is Evelyn, and I turned 56 this winter. I live in a small town in Vermont, where winters come heavy and holidays have always been sacred. For 30 years, Christmas Eve meant laughter, stockings, and the old record player spinning carols from a scratched vinyl we bought when we were young and broke but happy. It used to be my favorite night of the year, until that one. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel, how they remind us that no matter where we live, some emotions are universal. That night, I set the table for two. Roast in the oven, candles lit. The kind of quiet warmth that usually made him smile. But he didn't smile. He barely looked at me. There was something final in the air, a stillness that didn't belong to Christmas. When he finally spoke, the words didn't sound like my husband's voice. "Evelyn," he said softly, "I think it's time we let go." At first, I thought I'd misheard him. "Let go of what?" I asked, still pouring him wine, pretending not to understand. He looked down at his hands, and that's when I saw it. The ring was gone. The ring I'd slipped on his finger 31 years ago. I felt the world tilt, like the floor had dropped out beneath me. You'd think after decades together, I'd know how to handle a conversation like that. But how do you prepare for the moment when everything you built starts to quietly unbuild itself? I didn't cry. Not then. I just nodded, because if I opened my mouth, I knew I'd fall apart. The clock on the mantel ticked louder than usual. Somewhere, Silent Night played on the radio, and it felt like the cruelest song I'd ever heard. He said it wasn't about someone else. He said he just needed peace. Peace. As if I'd been the noise in his life. As if all our shared years, our children, our laughter, our quiet mornings, were nothing but static. I wanted to shout, "Peace from what? From me? From us?" But the words stayed buried. Because when you've loved someone that long, anger doesn't come first. It's disbelief that does. A slow, aching disbelief that feels heavier than rage. He packed a small bag, said he'd stay at his brother's for a few days, just to think, and then he left. I stood in the doorway, watching his taillights fade through the snow, realizing I didn't even know what we were anymore. Husband and wife? Strangers? Ghosts of something that used to be. I sat there for a long time after he drove away. The roast burned. The candles melted to nothing. And the house that once echoed with children's laughter felt impossibly still. In that silence, I thought about everything. The years, the effort, the quiet drift that had somehow led us here. Somewhere along the way, love had become routine, and routine had become absence. But here's the truth I couldn't admit then. I'd seen it coming, not in one moment, but in 100 small ones. The missed goodnight kisses, the distant eyes at breakfast, the way he'd started sleeping on the very edge of the bed as if space might save him from something. And yet, even as the reality settled in, I couldn't let go. Not on Christmas Eve. Not like that. Because, deep inside, I still believed there was something worth remembering, something buried beneath the silence. And as I sat there surrounded by fading lights and broken memories, one thought whispered through me like a prayer. Maybe the only way to remind him of what we lost is to show him what we once had. I didn't know it then, but that single thought, that quiet act of defiance against despair, would change everything that came after. Love doesn't disappear in a day. It erodes slowly, like paint peeling off an old wall, one season at a time. When I met Daniel, I was 24 and certain of everything. He was the kind of man who made life feel like an adventure, spontaneous, full of laughter, a dreamer who built furniture in our garage and kissed me every time he passed by. We married under an oak tree behind my parents' farmhouse, promising to stay the same forever. But forever, I've learned, is a fragile thing. We started with very little. A rented apartment above a bakery that smelled like fresh bread every morning. I used to leave notes for him on the counter. Silly romantic things. Don't forget to smile. Or, dinner's on the stove and so am I. He'd scribble back, see you soon, my wild one. Those were the golden years, before bills, before layoffs, before the world got too loud for us to hear each other. He lost his job first. A company downsizing, nothing he could have done. He said he was fine, but the light in his eyes changed. I started working double shifts at the clinic, thinking I was helping. But my helping became distance. We were two good people, trying to survive separately instead of together. Then came the years when silence lived in our house like an unwanted guest. Dinner turned into television noise. Goodnight became a habit, not affection. And when the kids grew up and left for college, we found ourselves alone again. But this time, we didn't know what to do with the quiet. I used to stare at him and wonder where the man I married had gone. He'd still mow the lawn, fix the leaky faucet, pay the bills, but it all felt mechanical, like we were maintaining a house, not a marriage. Sometimes he'd glance at me as if he wanted to say something. I'd wait, but the words never came. And over time, I stopped waiting. That's how love fades, not with betrayal or fireworks, but with the quiet acceptance that maybe this is just how things are now. But here's what I never told him. I blamed myself too. I'd stopped dressing up, stopped laughing at his jokes, stopped asking him how he felt because I was afraid of the answer. We both retreated behind politeness, kind words with no warmth, shared spaces with no connection. I used to imagine us as two ships tied to the same dock, rocking in the same tide, but never really touching anymore. By our 30th Christmas, the tension had become invisible but unbearable. The house looked beautiful that year. Lights strung across the porch, snow piled like frosting on the windowsill. But inside, it was cold. Not the kind of cold you can fix with blankets, but the kind that seeps into your bones because the warmth between two people is gone. At Christmas Eve, I watched him stare at the fire, eyes distant. He looked done. I didn't know it yet, but he had already made his decision. And though my heart must have known it, my mind refused to believe it. Looking back, maybe he wasn't cruel. Maybe he was just lost, the same way I was. We'd both been living beside each other, not with each other. And love, if left unattended long enough, starts to starve. By the time the next Christmas came around, the one when he asked for the divorce, I could barely recognize the man sitting across from me. His smile was polite, not tender. His voice careful, not kind. It's strange how someone you once knew better than yourself can one day feel like a guest in your own home. But life has a way of circling back, doesn't it? Because even though he had decided to leave, the universe wasn't done with us yet. There was still one memory, one forgotten relic of who we used to be, waiting to speak louder than either of us ever could. And that memory was buried in an old cardboard box in the attic, wrapped in dust and time, waiting to be found. The night he finally said it out loud, the world outside looked almost cruel in its beauty. Snow was falling in perfect silence, coating the street in white. The Christmas lights we'd hung together a week before blinked softly, painting our window with color. It should have been peaceful. It used to be. But inside, everything in me was breaking apart. I'd spent the whole day trying to make the evening feel special, as if tradition could save us. I made his favorite roast, set out the same old china we'd used since our wedding. I even lit the cinnamon candle he liked, though lately, he hardly seemed to notice things like that. I kept waiting for him to smile, or to thank me, or to say something that felt like us. But all he said was, "We need to talk." Those words, they carry weight when spoken by someone you love. They make your stomach twist because you already know what's coming before they even say it. He didn't shout. He didn't accuse. He just sat there, his voice calm, careful, almost rehearsed. "Evelyn," he said, "I don't think this is working anymore. I think it's time we end it." For a second, I couldn't move. I stared at the blinking lights behind him and thought, surely he can't mean that. We'd built a life together, raised children, buried parents, shared decades of birthdays and bills and small, quiet mornings. How do you walk away from that as if it's just another task to check off? "I don't understand," I whispered. "You mean after Christmas?" He shook his head. "I mean now. I'll stay with Michael for a while, just until we can sort things out." His words were gentle, but they cut through me like ice. I wanted to say something, to remind him of the promises we made under that oak tree years ago, of the way we used to hold hands in church and laugh at the same jokes. But every word that came to my tongue felt too small to hold what I was feeling. Instead, I sat there, staring at the untouched food on our plates, listening to the clock tick. The sound of it was maddening. Tick, another second gone. Tick, another piece of our life slipping away. I thought about the years that had led to this, the long silences, the polite distance, the way he'd stopped calling me Evie years ago. Maybe this was inevitable, I thought. Maybe love really does have an expiration date. We just don't see it until it's too late. He stood up, walked toward the hallway, and picked up his small overnight bag. It had already been packed. That detail hurt more than anything else. He'd planned this, maybe even rehearsed it. When he reached the door, he turned to look at me. For a moment, I saw something flicker in his eyes. Guilt, maybe regret. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared. He said, "You'll be okay, Evelyn. You're strong." And then he was gone. The door closed, and the house became unbearably quiet. The Christmas tree twinkled like nothing had happened. The clock kept ticking, and I sat there, a woman surrounded by everything we built together, realizing that I didn't know who I was without him. I went to the window, watched the snow swallow his car's taillights until they disappeared completely. Then I whispered into the silence, "I don't want to be strong tonight." For the rest of that evening, I wandered the house like a ghost. Every corner whispered a memory. Laughter echoing down the hallway. His voice reading bedtime stories to the kids. The smell of pancakes on Sunday mornings. I opened the old photo album on the coffee table and stared at the younger versions of us, smiling like they'd cracked the secret to happiness. I wanted to scream at that picture. Don't let go. Don't stop trying. Don't forget what you have. But the photo couldn't hear me, and he wasn't there. By midnight, I was sitting on the floor beside the Christmas tree, staring at the lights through tear-blurred eyes. And that's when I saw it. The old cardboard box tucked behind the presents. It was labeled Christmas Memories in my handwriting, faded and soft. I hadn't opened it in years. Inside were old ornaments, handwritten cards, and at the very bottom, a single VHS tape. On the label, in Daniel's messy handwriting, it said, "Our First Christmas, 1993. I held it in my hands for a long time. My fingers trembled. Part of me wanted to throw it away, to stop myself from reopening wounds that already hurt enough. But another part of me, the part that still believed in what we once were, wanted to remember. Because maybe remembering was the only thing left that could still save us. And so, with tears on my face and hope I didn't want to admit, I stood up, walked to the attic to find the old camcorder, and made a decision that we'd change the rest of our story. It took me almost an hour to find the old camcorder. It was buried under a pile of dusty Christmas decorations in the attic, its cord tangled with forgotten lights. The smell of cedar and old fabric filled the air. Every box I opened seemed to release another piece of the life we'd lived. Children's drawings, half-broken ornaments, birthday cards yellowed by time. When I finally sat on the floor, holding the tape in my hands, I hesitated. It felt like holding a piece of time itself. Fragile, sacred, dangerous. Part of me wondered if watching it would make things worse. After all, the man who'd filmed it wasn't the man who just walked out. What if seeing him, seeing us, only made the loss sharper? But then I thought about the promise we'd made our first Christmas together. No matter how old we get, let's always remember who we were when it began. So I decided to keep that promise, even if I was the only one left who would. I wiped the dust from the label, carried it downstairs, and plugged in the camcorder to the TV. The static flickered, the screen glowed, and then, just like that, there we were. 23-year-old Daniel, grinning with a Santa hat crooked on his head. Me, laughing behind the camera, telling him to stop being silly. The sound of our voices filled the room, and it was like being haunted by happiness. There we were, in that tiny apartment, with the peeling wallpaper and the cheap tinsel we thought looked glamorous. The table was set with 2 plates. A small tree leaned slightly to the left, and our love, our real, messy, beautiful love, filled every corner. I could hear our younger selves teasing, laughing, talking about dreams that hadn't yet been broken by time. He kept looking at me through the lens, saying, "One day we'll watch this when we're old and still in love." Those words cut deep, because here I was, older, and he was gone. The memories spilled out like light through a cracked door. Our first apartment, our first burned dinner. The night he surprised me with a second-hand piano and told me to learn enough to fill the silence. We looked so alive, so certain. I don't know how long I sat there watching. Maybe minutes, maybe hours. When the tape finally ended, the screen went blue, and I realized I was crying. Not the quiet tears of heartbreak, but the deep, shaking sobs that come when the past feels too close. And that's when I heard something. The front door creaked open. It was him, Daniel. Snow still on his coat, his eyes red. Maybe from the cold, maybe from something else. He looked at the screen, then at me. The blue glow of the TV reflected in his eyes. "You kept that?" he asked quietly. I nodded. I couldn't throw it away. It was the best part of us. He didn't answer. He just stood there, staring at our younger selves frozen in time. Then, slowly, he walked closer and sat down beside me on the floor. We didn't speak for a while. We just watched. 2 strangers sharing the ghost of who they used to be. At one point, the video showed him looking straight into the camera and saying, "If you're watching this years from now, Evelyn, I hope you still laugh like this." That was the moment his breath caught. I saw it. His shoulders dropped, his face softened, and for the first time in years, he cried. Without words, and in that silence, I realized something powerful. Maybe love doesn't die after all. Maybe it just gets buried under the noise, waiting for a moment like this to be remembered. He turned to me then, his voice breaking. "I forgot how much we used to laugh," he whispered. "So did I said. And though nothing was fixed, though the pain was still raw and real, there was something in his eyes I hadn't seen in years, something fragile and familiar. It wasn't love reborn, not yet, but it was remembrance, and sometimes that's where healing begins." The room stayed silent for a long time after the tape ended. The screen glowed blue, soft and cold against the shadows, the only light left in the room. The snow outside had stopped falling, and the world felt strangely still, like even time had paused to listen. Daniel didn't move. His eyes were fixed on the screen, but I could tell he wasn't watching it anymore. He was lost somewhere deep in those memories, maybe searching for the man he used to be. I wanted to speak, but I was afraid to break whatever fragile moment this was. So I sat quietly beside him, letting the hum of the old television fill the silence that used to divide us. Then, without looking at me, he whispered, "We were happy then." It wasn't a question. It was a confession. "Yes," I said softly. "We were." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes glistening. "What happened to us, Evie?" The nickname. I hadn't heard it in years. It broke something open inside me. I wanted to tell him that life happened. Bills, jobs, exhaustion, years of small misunderstandings that turned into walls. I wanted to say that love didn't vanish overnight. It just got quieter, thinner, until one day we couldn't hear it anymore. But instead, I said, maybe we forgot how to see each other. He looked at me then, really looked, like a man waking up after years of sleep. The clock ticked, the house creaked, the tree lights flickered. Everything felt alive again, but fragile, as if one wrong word could make it all vanish. I stood up, went to the kitchen, and brought back 2 mugs of cocoa. We used to drink it every Christmas Eve. I handed him one, and when our fingers brushed, I felt something familiar. Not romance exactly, but recognition. As we sat there sipping in silence, the tape still humming in the background, more memories began to surface. "Remember that Christmas," I said, smiling faintly, "when the power went out and we had to light every candle in the house?" He chuckled. "And you burned the cookies because you forgot the oven doesn't work during a blackout." We both laughed, really laughed, for the first time in what felt like years. The sound felt strange at first, then warm, healing. It reminded me of something I'd almost forgotten, that laughter used to be our language. He glanced back at the TV again. "You know," he said quietly, "I used to watch you dance around that old apartment when you thought I wasn't looking. I loved that version of you, the one who believed we could survive anything." The tears came before I could stop them. "She's still here," I whispered, "just tired." His eyes softened. He reached out, resting his hand on mine, hesitant, like he wasn't sure if he had the right anymore. And I let him, because in that small gesture, I felt the years between us melt, even if just for a moment. For a while, we said nothing. We just sat there, watching the flicker of light from the tree reflect in our mugs, feeling the weight of everything unsaid. The years hadn't been kind to us. But maybe, I thought, kindness doesn't come from years. It comes from moments like this, when 2 people decide to look at each other honestly again. Eventually, Daniel stood and walked to the window. The snow had stopped, leaving the world outside soft and still. "You know," he said, "I thought I was leaving to find peace. But maybe peace was never out there." He turned to me. Maybe it was always here, waiting. The words hung between us, heavy and trembling. I didn't know what to say. I didn't want to hope too much. Not yet. But for the first time in years, I felt the faintest spark of possibility. As he turned back toward the TV, I realized something profound. The tape hadn't just shown him who we used to be. It had reminded both of us why we became those people in the first place. Not out of obligation, not out of routine, but out of love, imperfect, unpolished, and real. When the screen finally went black, Daniel sighed, a long, tired exhale that sounded more like surrender than defeat. "I don't know what happens next," he said softly. "Neither do I," I replied. "But maybe we don't need to yet." And in that quiet living room, surrounded by ghosts of Christmas past, something fragile began to stir again. Not a promise, but a beginning. That night, after he went to bed in the guest room, not ours, I stayed awake on the couch, staring at the cold ashes in the fireplace. My heart was confused. Part of me felt relief. Another part still carried pain. Because love doesn't return just because you remember it. Sometimes, remembering is what hurts most. I replayed the evening over and over in my mind. The tape, his tears, the way he said my name. I didn't know if it meant he wanted to stay or if it was just nostalgia. But even if it was temporary, it was something. After months of silence, even a single real conversation felt like oxygen. Morning came slow. The house was dim and still, sunlight cutting through the blinds. When I walked into the kitchen, Daniel was already there, making coffee. He looked up and smiled faintly. It wasn't the smile I remembered, but it wasn't the cold, polite one from before either. It was human, hesitant, honest. We sat across from each other, the steam rising between us like a fragile peace treaty. He spoke first. I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that tape. I nodded. Me too. He took a breath. I meant what I said last night, about peace. I thought leaving would fix something, but all it did was make me feel emptier. I listened, not daring to interrupt. His voice shook slightly, like a man finally saying the words he'd swallowed for years. I think I stopped seeing you somewhere along the way. And when I finally looked up, I didn't recognize us anymore. It scared me. The honesty hurt, but it also healed. I stopped seeing you too, I admitted. I think we both forgot that love doesn't survive without being fed. We stopped feeding it. He looked at me, eyes wet again. Do you think it's too late? I smiled sadly. Maybe for the people we were, but not for the ones we could still become. There was a long silence after that, the kind that used to make me anxious. But this time, it felt okay, peaceful even. Because not every silence is empty. Some are full of everything that words can't say. Later that day, he packed his bag again. My heart clenched, thinking he was leaving for good. But he turned to me at the door and said, I'm not leaving forever. I just need a few days to think. But I'll come back, Evelyn, I promise. And this time, I believed him. As his car disappeared down the snow-covered road again, I didn't feel abandoned. I felt cleansed. The pain was still there, but it was lighter. Because for the first time in years, we'd spoken truth instead of pretending. And truth, even when it hurts, is a kind of love. That night, I replayed the tape again, not to grieve, but to remember. To remind myself that even after all the years, all the silence, all the hurt, something inside us still flickered. And as I watched my younger self laugh on that grainy screen, I realized maybe the purpose of remembering isn't to relive the past. Maybe it's to give the future a chance to begin again. I didn't know what would happen when he came back, if he'd want to rebuild or just say goodbye properly. But I did know one thing. This time, I wouldn't let silence win. 3 days passed. 3 long, slow, heavy days where the house echoed with memories. The snow outside had turned to slush, and the Christmas lights across the neighborhood began to fade one by one, as if the season itself was moving on. But I wasn't ready yet. Every night, I'd find myself sitting in front of that old tape player again, watching the same moments on repeat. I wasn't looking for answers anymore. I was trying to remember how we looked at each other when life was simpler. It wasn't the laughter or the kisses that held me. It was the unspoken trust in our eyes, the kind that says, "I choose you, no matter what tomorrow brings." On the 4th morning, I heard a car pull into the driveway. My heart jumped before my mind could catch up. When I opened the door, there he was, standing in the cold, snowflakes tangled in his hair, holding a small cardboard box. His face looked tired, but softer, different. "I didn't know if I should knock," he said, his voice low. "You still remember where the key is," I replied, half smiling. He smiled back faintly, stepped inside, and placed the box on the table. I noticed his wedding ring was back on his finger. It wasn't there before. "What's that?" I asked, nodding toward the box. "Old tapes," he said. "I found them in the garage. Thought maybe we could watch them together." My throat tightened. I nodded, unable to speak. We sat again in that same living room, the one that had witnessed so much distance, and now, maybe, something like healing. As he pressed play, the screen flickered with images of birthdays, lazy Sundays, and small, ordinary moments. Moments we'd stopped cherishing once they became routine. Then there was one I didn't remember recording, a clip from years ago. It was Christmas morning, maybe 5 or 6 years into our marriage. We were sitting on the floor, surrounded by wrapping paper and coffee mugs, talking about how love changes. Daniel's younger voice filled the room. "Do you ever worry we'll wake up one day and feel like strangers?" And my voice, gentle, laughing, replied, "Then we'll start over, as many times as it takes." When that line played, the air went still. Daniel turned to me, his eyes searching mine, and whispered, "You meant that, didn't you?" I swallowed hard, every word. He looked down, fidgeting with his hands, the way he used to when he was nervous. "I forgot that version of us," he said quietly. I let the noise drown it out. The job, the bills, the pride. I thought being right mattered more than being kind. I felt tears sting my eyes, but I didn't stop them. "We both did," I said. "We let life harden us. We stopped forgiving. We stopped laughing. But somewhere under all that, we're still here. For the first time in a long time, there were no walls between us. Just raw, imperfect truth." He reached out his hand slowly, like he wasn't sure if he deserved to touch me. I took it. And just like that, the world grew quiet again. Not empty, but full. Full of everything we tried to bury. After a long silence, he said, "I don't want to start over somewhere else, Evelyn. I want to start over here, with you." The words didn't sound like a grand declaration. They sounded like a prayer. Simple, honest, and tired of running. I didn't say yes immediately. I just nodded, tears falling freely. "Then let's start with today," I whispered. He smiled, that old, soft smile I thought was gone forever. Today sounds perfect. We didn't need to say anything more, because sometimes the most powerful forgiveness doesn't come through words. It comes through choosing to stay when leaving would have been easier. That night, we sat together again, not as the same couple from years ago, but as two people willing to rebuild brick by fragile brick. And as the tape clicked off and the screen went dark, I realized something quietly profound. Love doesn't survive because it's perfect. It survives because someone somewhere chooses to begin again, even when it hurts. It's been a few months since that Christmas Eve, the night everything fell apart and somehow began again. The house feels warmer now, not because anything magical happened, but because we started showing up differently. We talk more. We argue softer. We listen longer. Some days are still hard. Rebuilding always is, but there's grace in the effort. Sometimes I still find Daniel in the living room, sitting in front of the old TV, watching that first Christmas tape. He says it reminds him of the promise we almost forgot, the one that said love isn't about feeling good all the time. It's about staying true when everything feels heavy, and I think he's right. That night taught me something I'll never forget, that love doesn't end the moment it breaks. It ends when you stop fighting for it. But if you can find even a small reason to remember, sometimes that's enough to spark it back to life. I used to think Christmas miracles were about bright lights and perfect moments. But now I know the real miracles happen in the quiet, in the pause before forgiveness, in the moment when pride falls away and love whispers, try again. If you're listening to this and you felt that distance, that cold silence between two hearts, maybe this is your reminder. Sometimes the only thing standing between a broken marriage and a healed one is the courage to remember why you began. Maybe it's time to dust off your own old tape, literal or not, and look back at who you once were together. Not to live in the past, but to remind yourselves that love once bloomed there. And if it bloomed once, it can bloom again. Because love doesn't vanish. It fades when forgotten. It weakens when neglected. But when remembered, even faintly, it begins to stir again. Daniel and I still aren't perfect. We still mess up. We still get quiet. We still have our moments. But every Christmas Eve now, we play that same tape. And not to mourn, but to give thanks. Because that night, when he asked for a divorce, I thought we had reached the end. But what I didn't realize was that sometimes endings are just love's way of asking for a new beginning. And maybe that's the truest Christmas miracle of all, quietly.